Disney lost their magic. The new Lion King movie just hit the cinemas, and I think it's fair to say that the reception has been pretty divisive between audiences. This movie simultaneously looks fantastic and terrible at the same time. On the one hand, visually, this movie is stunning, bringing realism CGI animation to a whole new level of believable. So much so that they have the gall to try and call this a live action movie. And that to a certain degree makes sense. It's certainly easier than actually training real animals to perform the right actions, but by using CGI animation, they can also make these realistic animals move in much more extravagant ways than any kind of training can do. For example, lip syncing. Let's just take on right away one of the most controversial parts of the whole movie. Welcome to Movie Monday on the channel, everybody. So during the build-up of the release of the film, Disney released some clips of small sections of the film, as movie productions often do these days for marketing reasons. But with the live-action Lion King, it had a bit more of a bite than people expected, particularly from the lip-syncing attempts to make an actual warthog look like it's speaking. Because really, when you look at it, it's not too good, and there is a reason to that. The entire theming across this movie and its production is full-scale realism. Realism over art. The art comes from the realism you're witnessing on screen in fantastic quality. So while the animated original Lion King would have all speaking animals move their mouths however you would imagine them to correctly articulate their words, the live-action Lion King completely scraps that, and highlighting the physical actions that each animal can actually do as a bigger priority. So for something as stiff as a warthog, it can be a little jarring. But this effect takes precedence over every other animal in the movie as well. The lion's mouth movements are often minimal and subtle as they can be, but they have a little more fluidity because of their body structure. But on top of that, there are some exceptions. Scattered throughout the film are what are essentially money shots. Clearly important lines that required some extra production work, as in these occasional shots, the lip syncing is suddenly much more on point and dedicated to properly getting the words across. The one that stood out to me the most was at the climax with Scar looking down on Simba and muttering, "I killed Mufasa." This line, more than anything, was superbly animated onto Scar's face, better than 90% of the rest of the lines in the film. And logistically, it makes sense. The production team behind this would have had a massive workload to create this animated masterpiece, and prioritizing the most iconic moments clearly is the correct choice. But the many corners cut for the directorial style of the rest of the film can leave a lot to be desired for some audience members. Though on the other hand, sometimes it works in their favor. I personally love how Zazu was animated in this rendition throughout the film, simply by having him constantly moving his head to the side when looking around, much like birds would naturalistically do to watch something with their 360-degree vision. It just, it's beautiful. Not to mention, for as much as he could, John Oliver as Zazu just completely stole the show for me with his voice acting. Zazu was already quite the comedic character with his wimpy personality and whiny desire for some actual structure, but John Oliver managed to push that character to always get a laugh out of me whenever he spoke some words. And honestly, I feel it's quite a no-brainer that the best voice acting probably came from this guy, because many of the other characters were kinda watered down. Obviously, with this fully realistic directorial vendetta on the whole movie, most characters were much less cartoony than beforehand. That makes perfect sense. But it is still majorly disappointing to hear. Pumbaa and Zazu were the stars of the heightening show, with almost every one of their lines having some kind of passionate twang to really get that fun vibe to their words. But on the flip side, important characters like Nala always just sounded monotonal and washed out, never really putting in that cartoony passion that's like 50% of the benefits that voice acting a character has. Their lines never really had that punch that truly got you into their characters' emotions. Sorry, Beyonce, I'm sure it's a directorial thing. Since you've made it this far, consider subscribing, or follow my freshly made Instagram account to see more of me off screen. And if you're really dedicated, I'll have my other links at the end of this video, so do check those out too. Thank you. Because this idea of the film being watered down extends further than just the animation and the voice acting. It's even there in the soundtrack. Not even the great Hans Zimmer can stop this theming of just being less than the original. This is The Lion King, one of Disney's most iconic stories, and we all know how it goes. We know the plot lines ins and outs, we know what the songs are and when they're gonna play, so one would expect when watching this movie to just be able to go along with this ride that we'd be somewhat familiar with, just in a new light and style. But something is definitely missing here. Like, Scar's big warning song to the hyenas talking about being prepared and ready for the death of Mufasa, it starting off and you can kinda get into this new version of the song that sounds more like talking than singing, but then later on it never really hits into your gut like the animated original did. Or one that I found particularly hard to ignore, the stampede of wildebeest coming into the gorge. I actually had the luxury of being able to watch the theatre show of The Lion King in London a few months ago, and for this segment, the whole stage was just boomingly loud. You'd first see a rotary projection of wildebeests moving down the hill in the distance, then small physical puppet silhouettes appear just in front, and then the next layer has them bouncing up and down even closer and larger, and then a final layer of giant wildebeest towering over poor Simba in the front of the stage, all while the drums beat louder and louder as the wildebeest loomed closer and closer. That experience alone was absolutely amazing, and it's probably the most iconic moment of the entire Lion King plot. Now, how does the live-action Lion King cover this milestone? Well, for a start, there is none of that shot of wildebeest running down a giant cliff in the distance. It's gone, because obviously that's just not realistic. You do see the wildebeest running down into the gorge, but it's not nearly as dramatic, as it barely looks like a drop at all in comparison. It's done as a wide shot to show how many wildebeest are running in, and sure, that works fine, but I feel it could have done with something closer up to fill the frame up more, or just show all the feet diving down into the gorge or something. Anything to make it more powerful than it looks, because it's underwhelming to say the least. And those drums? I mean, they're probably there still, but it's not nearly as noticeable. You'd expect the drums to be really kicking in and working to hit you in the gut or in your soul even, telling you of the impending danger as it gets closer and closer. But it just doesn't happen. The volume and bass doesn't really get predominantly louder, if it even changes at all. And that's kind of a theme throughout the whole film. Nothing really punches at you in the soundtrack this time around. And generally, it just left me feeling like I was just watching a two-dimensional movie. Like, I didn't feel the emotion in that moment at all. It didn't look crazy, and I didn't hear it riling me up anywhere close to the level of the animated original movie or the theatre show did. The only thing that I really felt in this sequence were the brutal changes to some of the actions, like Mufasa repeatedly being mashed into by the wildebeest, or Scar choosing to drop him off the cliff by gashing him in the face rather than lifting his arms out. And actually, that's something I think the live-action Lion King does bring positively to the story: the changes. I imagine working on the script of this film was relatively easy, as 90% of the lines are just the same as they were before, and you kinda know what to expect anyway, but this movie is new. It's got some elements of that modern twang. One of the most prominent changes is the jokes. Spiced throughout the film are some new little jokes that did genuinely surprise and delight me in places, like Zazu describing a cousin who thought he was a woodpecker, Pumbaa laughing with the lines about how he thought he was dead, forget Simba, or how Timon and Pumbaa distract the hyenas not with dragon dancing, cause that would be too unrealistic, but with Be Our Guest from Beauty and the Beast, which lasts much less time since the hyenas chase them almost immediately. These modern little moments, I really enjoyed. Some a little less so. Like, it was cool that when singing about Pumbaa's backstory, they didn't interrupt themselves to censor each other like the original. That's a nice little reference, and I like that we actually saw the backstory take place visually, but generally there are a lot more fart jokes in this movie. Do production teams just think children are more dumb than ever these days? I was also sat next to a couple who were just constantly guzzling glasses of wine, and they found the original jokes to be hysterical too. What's the motto? Nothing. What's the matter with you? Had them screaming with laughter for a solid 60 seconds afterwards, so I guess the film is objectively funny. But moving away from jokes, there were a good amount of other more important changes that sidestepped away from the original animation. There were super minor things like line tweaks that I'm not enough of a veteran to really notice. There were some logistical improvements like Simba biting Scar's neck to get back up on the cliff during the climax, a sequence showing just how Nala escaped from Pride Rock to find help, and Rafiki using lightning bugs to create an image of Simba, which is pretty cool to see. But then there were some other changes that I would argue only made the film that little bit worse than the original, and right off the bat is the very first scene after the Circle of Life. That whole scene with the mouse is drastically extended to the point that it very much overstayed its welcome and had a really weird pacing issue right at the start. For far too long do we see this simple little mouse exploring all across this realistic land, only to be finally caught by Scar for his mini little monologue. I guess the point of it all was to show off all of the visual prowess this movie is going to provide? Or to make you want some kind of docu-series built into this engine sometime in the future? Whatever it was supposed to do, it was already not going to be the best opener considering the Circle of Life already played moments before this sequence, introducing us to the visual design. And also, I imagine most audience members just ended up daydreaming halfway through the sequence anyway. And this weird pacing issue repeats again later on in the film with Simba's fur. This time ever so slowly making its way across the lands, through birds, to birds' nests, to leaves, to a giraffe. Now that's cool and all, a bit weird, but already that sequence then fades to black for an awful long time and comes in again with a dung beetle rolling some dung with that fur all attached. It makes its way to an ant and the ant unknowingly brings it to Rafiki. It's the Circle of Life, yada yada yada. And Rafiki now knows Simba's alive. Cool, great, whatever. But like, that whole sequence was way too long for what it needed to be. A simple montage cutting between each animal could have sufficed, and that fade to black transition had me pretty confused at first. Obviously it makes sense now since time would have passed for the giraffe and all, but that pacing of it was just all too slow and boring. Honestly, if David Attenborough was talking over the top of it, I would have been far more satisfied, but otherwise, that's just too much downtime. And that's just the two changes I have issues with. Another one that's more just a disappointment than anything else is Rafiki. He doesn't get his iconic staff until the very end of the film, meaning that scene of lesson learning with Simba never comes to be this time around. But probably the most unsatisfactory change, which is an unavoidable logistic change, is the I just can't wait to be king sequence. And this right here is the definitive example of just how watered down this film is sometimes. Obviously, in this rendition, Simba can't walk along the top of the animals. There can't be any circus-looking extravaganza, and because it's this film, the actual song can't be too passionate and pumped up either. In reality, all we see is Simba and Nala running in between the legs of the towering animals as the song somewhat plays in the background. It's not nearly as fun, it's not nearly as passionate, and none of the animals take part in the song either. No one looks left, no one looks right. It's just something to watch. You can't participate in any way. And it all comes down to that seriously natural directorial choice. Animation-wise, they could have totally had Simba do these crazy stunts. It just doesn't fit the chosen style. Except for when it's a random small scene with Timon and Pumbaa and the other animals of the jungle or something, I guess. So going back to that original question, has Disney lost their magic? Cause what we have right here is an old classic reinvigorated into a new format. It's got new tweaks, new visuals, and a good chunk of an all-new cast, ready and prepped for the next generation of audiences. But does it still have that magic? Obviously, this film is good. The story is The Lion King, so the story is gonna be great. The visuals are masterful. This is the kind of quality that is truly unrivaled, so it's gonna look great. And yet, something feels missing. And I think it purely comes down to the other elements of its presentation. The audio is muted down, substandard and uninteresting. The voice is boring, the music non-outstanding, and the songs practically shafted. The heightened emotion and passion of this film leaves something to be desired to the point that you can watch this film, but you can't really feel it. The film is technically amazing, but the project's biggest flaw is a simple one, and it was staring us in the face from the very first frame or screenshot of footage we saw. It does a good job of what it wishes to do, but to be another icon, it just needed a simple, loving spread of some saturation, some heart. Now doesn't that just look better? Better than the dull, muted and watered down reality. But hey, it's all just a matter of opinion. Like, despite all these words, I still enjoyed the film. It's The Lion King. I smiled, I laughed, I cared enough to talk about it long afterwards. So if you enjoyed this movie, then good for you. Go enjoy it. I probably won't voluntarily watch this a second time. I kinda get the premise at this point, but I'm very much glad that I saw it at least once. So let me know, what were your thoughts on the animated live-action Lion King remake? Love it, hate it, meh it? I await your thoughts down in the comments below, but for now, I better end it off here. Check out my links coming up soon, but for now, my name's been Dazz, you didn't really care, and I'll see you in a bit. Oh. It took me far too long to realize that the director of Lion King live action is actually actually the guy who plays Happy in Spider-Man and the MCU. Oops. The fact that you made everything super realistic is really cool. I just don't think it really fit for a story that's clearly better in an animated, more cartoony form. The concept's cool, maybe a better story would have done with it, or just put some extra pump, put some emotion in it. Be a bit more than realistic. Be a bit better than realistic, you know? Otherwise, yeah, you know, big fan and all that.